3 weeks here before I head out on vacation in July. So this Sunday, the 28th, and then July 5th, I think, something like that. 4th, 5th, one of those two. 5th is the 5th, because 12th is popular. That we definitely know what we're going to do with, and so I have decided, or we decided last week, on nothing. but I kind of turned nothing into something. So I'm kind of calling this, it's going to be a smorgasbord 3 weeks. In other words, we're going to just kind of hop around between a bunch of things. One of the ideas that was put forward last week is somebody threw out the book of Joel, and I took that and ran with it in that doing a study on Joel isn't all, well, it's not that it's not interesting. It's, well, we'll get into, I'll explain myself here in a little bit. What I did is I took that and I said, today we're going to talk about the minor prophets as a whole today, okay? We might do that next week as well too, but for the 3 weeks I want to talk about the minor prophets and some of the minor epistles. And again, OR, not ER. They're small, they're not wearing helmets with lights on them. Never gets old. So, it's because it's one of those things where, like, for example, the letter of Jude, right? It's the penultimate letter, it's the penultimate book in the New Testament. It comes right before Revelation. We never talk about Jude. One of the reasons is that Jude is only like 255 words. It's very short. It's remarkably short in the picture of the whole canon. But also, and this is going to be a theme both of the minor prophets and of the minor epistles, which is that they're intensely contextual, okay? Meaning that Jude was written towards the end of the 1st century addressing a very specific concern that the author saw arising in the Christian community. And so, in terms of it being applicable to the broader life of preaching and teaching, unless we're dealing with that specific thing, we just don't stumble upon it all that often. And the same thing is true of the minor prophets. So what we're going to do over these 3 weeks is we're going to hop around. I can't adequately do an in-depth explanation of all 12 of the minor prophets and all X number of the minor epistles. So we're going to kind of explore them a little bit together. I can give you some background, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Does that make sense? So, any questions thus far? Yes?
Approximately when or what year was the decision made on which particular books to include?
That's a great question, Susan. So, this is actually really important. So Susan asked, when did the Bible come to be the Bible? To summarize what your question is about. And the short version is that there were 2 ecumenical councils in the latter half of the 4th century. Or 5th century, the 400s. There were 2 ecumenical councils in the latter half of the 5th century that kind of did that. The much more complicated answer is that the canon was not chosen in a day. It was built over several centuries. And it's true both of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So how we arrived at what we have now is through the growth of Christianity, there were writings that Christian communities found valuable and authoritative, and there were writings that they didn't. And the writings that they found helpful and authoritative became what we call canon, insofar as that it was kind of a use case thing. They were using these things frequently, right? And so by the time the institution, post-Constantine, by the time the institution of the church got around to saying what's in and what's out, the Bible already existed. One of the misconceptions is that, at the Council of, it's not Nicaea, I can never remember. One of them's the Council of Trent, and the other one's the Council of something. Carthage, maybe? I don't know. One of the misconceptions Sessions is that they took all 66 books of the Bible, well, or like, plus however many more were for consideration, and they just voted in and out. It's like, no, that didn't happen. Effectively, what happened is my gosh, I think it's the Council of Cardinals. I don't know. Look it up there. The ecumenical council basically said, yes, whatever we've got here is what we're gonna call a canon, if that canon, to simplify it. Okay. So for what becomes the Bible for Christianity, you have something like the letter of Jude being debated within the community as early as the 2nd century. Okay, so Jude is written sometime in around 90 Common Era. Okay, during the 2nd century, you have Christian communities essentially saying, "Is this authoritative and is this valuable to our conversation?" Now, what's fascinating about that is when you're that close to how the cake is being made, it must give you a different perspective on for us 2,000 years later, I think a lot of Christians operate on this kind of idea that, I don't know, somebody waved a magic wand at some point and the Bible became the magical Bible. It was much more earthy than that. It was much more human, insofar as that it was real human beings kind of working out what was helpful for them. We know that what have become our 4 Gospels were kind of the cornerstone. They were the foundation for what we call the New Testament, right? So for what becomes the canon. That actually was one of the things that was figured out right away. There was, and again, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but there was effectively a division drawn between our 4 Gospels and what we now refer to as apocryphal or Gnostic Gospels, and it mainly to do with the narrative. So, John being unique amongst the 4, again, we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptic for a reason. They all follow the same narrative, right? So, with some variation, if you were to look at a concordance, with some variation, you have Jesus' birth narrative, all the way to crucifixion, and then a little bit of additional stuff depending on which gospel you're reading, okay? But the overall narrative arc is Jesus is born, he's baptized, he goes out in the wilderness, he recruits some people, he does some things, he turns his face towards Jerusalem and takes some people off, gets arrested, gets crucified. Boom. Okay. Has anybody read any of the Gnostic Gospels? Yeah. A lot of them are kind of just collections, right? I'm thinking of the Gospel of Thomas. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's like it's not Thomas. One of those guys' names. The Gospel of Thomas it's really kind of a grab bag of stories, including stories of Jesus' infancy, or childhood. So it's not so much that the church said no, these are wrong or false. They just said they don't really fit. They don't really fit, and that's why when people ask me about the Gnostic Gospels, I'm like, well, there's a reason we don't hold them to be authoritative or valuable. It's because they're not. They're cool, and whether or not they're pointing at some truth about the life of Jesus, maybe, I don't know. But the other thing is a lot of those are actually post-canonical, not post-canonical. They come like 2nd and 3rd centuries. They're much, much later than the stuff that we're pointing. By and large, everything that makes its way into the canon, like 125 is the cutoff. 125 CE is the latest book, and that's like maybe one of the letters of John, I think 3rd John or something like that, and that's even a ballpark. So that's kind of like when we stop including stuff, if that makes sense. It makes sense structurally as well too, because this is right around the time when Christianity starts to become Christianity, right? So it starts getting legs. It's becoming a bit of a self-aware institution in that regard. Hebrew Bible. Sorry, Susan, this is a longer answer than you're looking for. Hebrew Bible is similar, but the dates that are important for the Hebrew Bible are post-exile. So 5th and 4th century BCE, and the translation of the Septuagint. Okay. Forgot A. Well, that's illegible. Whatever. So the Hebrew people come out, the Judeans come out of exile. They return to Jerusalem, Judea, and the temple is rebuilt by Cyrus. And I'm really, this isn't even perfect. This is conjecture. It's a little, it's kind of, I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Qualifying? No. Essentially what happens in my brain is that the who's who of the religious establishment in Judea, which is new, because keep in mind they're coming out of slavery, exile, in Babylon. So they're rebuilding infrastructure and government and all that stuff. And whoever is involved in those decision-making processes is like, we should probably write this stuff down. Right? We should probably, and not just, one of the other misconceptions is that everything was oral tradition and they all just wrote it down from memory. There were certainly hard copies that existed beforehand. But what happens in a lot of cases is that they're taking collections of prophetic traditions and editing them and compiling them. Book of Isaiah, perfect example, where you've got, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. This is the way that we categorize them. 1 through 39, 40 through 60, and 61 through 66. Isaiah didn't live 200 plus years. Right? And so how we end up getting a prophetic witness that spans that amount of time is really interesting. It's a fascinating question whether there's an original prophet who then has disciples who take up the mantle after he dies. Who knows? Okay? But one of the things that we do know, and with a lot of confidence, is that that Isaiah, as we have it, not necessarily made in the Hebrew Bible, insofar as that these are all kind of narratives that cover the same material, but they're effectively different accounts of the same narrative. And so if you can imagine what's going on, is that these people are coming out of exile and going, we should probably write this stuff down. We should probably compile it and put it together, just in case this happens again, right? And it's not just in case this happens again. It's also like, it's them picking up the pieces of who they are, okay? So, during this time period is where you effectively get what we now refer to as the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. It doesn't become a thing until the Septuagint is translated. And it's not official, right? There's nobody's like, I declare that we fix the canon for the Hebrew Bible, okay? No, what happens is, I can't remember who commissions it. Some dude commissions it, says, we should translate this, and so a bunch of rabbis in Alexandria, Egypt, 70 supposedly, get together, and they translate. But of course, what they're doing is they're making choices. They're deciding what they translate, okay? And what they decide to translate is what effectively becomes the Torah, or what becomes the Tanakh.
So was it oral tradition or actually written?
Both. It's both. And this is the tough thing, and we'll get into this when we talk about the minor prophets. Is dating stuff is hard. Specifically, Joel, the range of dates that scholars propose for the authorship of Joel is like 500 years. Like it's somewhere between 900 BCE and 500 BCE or 400 BCE. And it really depends, because here's the problem: is Joel talks about stuff that's happening here, okay, which would date it to that. But the problem is there's stuff that's talked about there are phrases and things that are used in Joel which are pulling from other minor prophetic traditions which post-date that. So in other words, it's like if somebody had written a history of Roman times, but they talk about cell phones. Right? That's rough. That's a really rough example. But there are concepts that are in Joel that arise later. So we're feeling around in the darkness. The question is like, was there a Joel tradition that dates all the way back to 900 BC that's passed on either orally or in written form? And in this time period, the editors of the Tanakh are like, okay, we're going to include this, but it needs some polishing. In other words, we need to contemporize the language a little bit. Just keep in mind, 500 years is a long time. Look at how much our language has changed over 500 years, right? So like, we need to put this in the vernacular. And so they do some editing, which theoretically changes the content and nature of Joel, but also maintains. But we don't know, right? Because all we've got are the fragments that come from this, right? All we've got is the body of the text that comes from this time period. We don't have any fragments dating from before this time period, right? None of that exists. That's all. If there were tablets or scrolls or sheets of paper, they disappeared a long time ago. Okay, so we're kind of looking back on the formation of the Tanakh in this direction, if that makes sense, right? We're seeing it through the lens of those who were forming it and translating it. So this is like when you talk about a book like Genesis. Genesis is so complicated. Genesis, similar to like the Gospel of Thomas, is a grab bag of stories that was edited together into a seemingly cohesive narrative. Okay? Sorry, it's okay. It's Smorgasbord Sunday. It's all right. If you're finding this interesting, I'm happy to keep talking about it. Are you guys familiar with JDP? Okay. We're going extra credit today. Okay. So the prevailing theory on the editing, the formation of the book of Genesis is the JDEP theory. Okay, which it's an acronym, which I'll explain in a second. And the JDEP theory, man, I wish Ryan and Anna were here, comes about early 20th century. I can't remember the guy or guys that come up that kind of begin to form the idea. But this has been around for a long time. This is, 100 years, okay? This isn't like past 20. This is a foundational understanding of biblical scholarship. The JDEP theory is that there were effectively 4 tranches with 4 buckets of editing that were done. And each of those buckets corresponds to a tradition. So J is the Yahwist, which is confusing because we would use a Y, but it's the German, just trust me, it's the Yahwist. Okay? Deuteronomic, okay? Elohist, and priestly, okay? These are 4 different edits. I should put it this way, 4 different fingerprints that we can see in the editing of Genesis. You understand what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Okay? Theoretically, the most recent is this one. Okay? And I'm not up to date on biblical scholarship. By and large, the priestly group is also the folks that scholars suspect are responsible for the overall picture. So that we're doing this work. Okay? Now, it might not have just been the priest. There might have been some competing traditions going on. But what's important to understand is that these two especially are earlier traditions, earlier editing traditions, okay? And these are the guys kind of doing the work at the end to fit everything together, okay? This is the one that's somewhere in the middle, okay? And the way to really simplify, because it's actually pretty complex the way that they can find these fingerprints in the text. One of the major ways that they find the fingerprints in the text is how the name of God is spelled. So the Yahwist tradition, whenever God is mentioned, you will literally get the tetragrammaton. You will get Yod-He, Vav-He. And Jews would not say Yahweh, they would say Adonai, okay, which is, because you don't say the name of God. but whenever the name of God is spelled, it's this. And you will know this because in some translations of the Bible, they will do all caps Lord, okay, which is a way of indicating this is the Yahwist, okay. Elohist is, you get Elohim being used for God's name, okay. This is one of the easier to understand ways that we're seeing these fingerprints. The other ways that they see these fingerprints is in grammar, composition, all the ways that you can understand when a kid uses AI to write their paper. Right? Which, is you're doing forensic kind of post-editing. I'm not saying that AI wrote Genesis. I'm just saying, you can tell, even before AI became a thing, you can tell when a kid's just quoting directly from Wikipedia, right? Which is a thing. When a kid, or before Wikipedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica, where they just literally copy-pasted rather than, because, come on kids, just at least paraphrase it, put it in your own language. Whether you learn anything or not, at least make it, at least pretend to do. Okay. So those are the ways in which we do this. So this is a really helpful way just to kind of understand the Hebrew Bible in general. And this is why it's not a book, it's a library. Even Genesis is a library. It's a library. These are not modern sensibilities in these fables. But
are there pictures in it?
Yes.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yes. Yeah, that's what he was looking for, is these illustrations that he thought were great growing up. But that's a kind of a good example of how often Scripture works. Is we're grouping things like these things are similar. They should go together. Now, granted, when you take something like the book of Joshua, or the King's narrative, or the Chronicles narrative, the Samuel narrative, there's a cohesive story going on, right? But even in that cohesive story, we can see the fingerprint of the editor at times, who can't resist throwing in a piece of commentary, right? Analyzing the why. This is why they failed. Kings, perfect example, where you get to that section of 2 Kings where it's like, and then this king took over from the previous king, and he was as bad as the king before him because he did X, Y, and Z. And you can hear the editor, right, sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem going, this is why we're at where we're at. Like, come on, buddy. Kurt.
I got a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to play
Devil's advocate.
Ask the actor. No. So when you get into Chronicles and Kings, a lot of times they'll get to the end of the story and they'll say, are this not written in the annals of the king? And it's like, well, no, I don't have those. Are those part of Chronicles or somewhere else, or are those just lost to history?
Oh man, this is $1 million question. But this is the stuff that, and Ryan and Anna, the King's Chronicle stuff, the Ketuvim is not their bailiwick. Ryan and Anna do wisdom and prophets are their main jam. But short answer is D, yes to all the above, which is that if on one hand it is the editor's way of saying this is not a comprehensive account.
Right. So is he referencing something they would have had access to colloquially on a regular basis?
We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. We don't know. Because the problem with the King's Chronicles stuff is that, one of the prevailing theories of Chronicles is it's actually a commentary on Kings. So it's like, there's the King's narrative is a narrative that predates, that goes back to, that it's compiled something, maybe during exile. And they are writing the King's narrative as an attempt to kind of document the history leading up to exile. And then they write the Chronicles narrative saying, but let's talk about why, right? It's like, okay, yeah, there's this account, but let's talk about the reason that things went poorly. And also, a lot of people will point to these guys as the source of the Chronicles tradition. Okay. Another good example of this is not Esther.
Ruth?
No, not Ruth. Good call out though. It's we're coming later. It was one that we talked about a year ago, where we were talking about conflicting commands in the Hebrew Bible. I was stealing the presentation that my friend Anna did, and I'm showing it here. And it's a debate. It's because Ruth was the other side of that debate, which is it okay to marry an outsider? And Ruth gives this wonderful narrative of the Moabites being the heroes of the story and mixing with and then this other book, which, man, is escaping me, just flat out says, the reason Israel fell to pieces is because we married outside of our people. Right? Where was I going with that? I don't know. In terms of being able to see the fingerprint of the editor there, right?
Has the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of confirmed some of that history?
Ish. It's kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing. Insofar as that, what the Dead Sea Scrolls did is gave us more copies, and in some cases more cohesive copies of things that we had fragments of. Okay? By and large, this is, again, the media needs to have a story. By and large, the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't really shake up anything that we already knew. All it did was give scholars more data points in terms of making sure that the manuscript is cohesive, if that makes sense.
I'm curious about the Apocrypha, which is those books in the middle. And when did they, and why don't the Catholics have more books than you and all of that?
So, okay. There are multiple types of canon outside of canon. So you'll hear them referred to as the Apocrypha. You'll hear it referred to as intertestamental literature. There's a third kind of catch-all that I can't think of in the moment, but and those fall into a couple of different categories, which is, so intertestamental literature is exactly what it sounds like. So there's the Old Testament and the New Testament, and if we're putting a date stamp on this, we'll call this 400 BCE, and we'll call this 50 CE. Well, to 125, right? Okay. Intertestamental stuff is stuff that's written in between these two times. But this is complicated because, when we talk about the book of Daniel has material that goes up even into the 3rd century. Right? So when they were translating the Septuagint, somebody was like, Daniel needs to have this other stuff that was written later too. And they made, these aren't stupid people. You're making very informed and choices. Why they chose that, I don't know. Why Daniel even makes it into the canon is surprising, just considering the timeline of it. So intertestamental literature is stuff that will show up in the Apocrypha. So that includes stuff like the book of Enoch, the book of Susanna, the book of Tobit, the book of Sirach. I don't have these memorized because I don't deal with them too much. So it's stuff, again, that's written in there.
Was there ever a Book of Mary?
A book of Mary.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Okay.
Like, you mean written about Mary or written
Or
for Mary?
written by Mary?
No.
Okay.
I can say that with 100% certainty.
Well, not in the Bible, but there's some other stuff. What is that other thing that's written that isn't always accepted?
Gnostic.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
Mary, there's Mary in there.
Here, okay. This is my Mary never learned to write. I can 100% guarantee that. And I'm not, this is not a critique of Mary, the person. I'm just talking about the reality of her situation. She was probably married at 14, had Jesus at 14 and a half. Well, no, 13 and a half, right? Well, again, joke, okay, I don't have to elaborate that. And it was a poor woman living in ancient Israel. So I'm 99% certain Mary never learned to write. Okay. And so the question, does something exist, or, no, better question, did something exist accounting Mary's perspective? Maybe, but it didn't survive, unfortunately. I for one would love to have that. I would love to have the gospel according to Mary, right? Would that existed? It don't, unfortunately. And if somebody, miraculously discovers it and says it, I would tell it.
The Magnificat is so beautifully
Yeah.
and poetic.
Yes.
Who
Yes,
wrote that?
Mary. Well, okay. Oh man, we need to talk about tradition too. Okay. So the Magnificat is the song that Mary sings after she discovers that she's, giving birth to the Messiah, giving birth to Jesus. Is that verbatim what Mary's saying? Likely not. Is that an edited, or edited is the wrong word here.
Yeah.
Is that the hymn that is attributed to Mary that is passed through the tradition of early Christianity? Yes.
Well, there are only two people who could say what she
Yeah.
said,
That's right.
and Mary and Elizabeth.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Is Miriam's song that she sings after the sea swallows up the Egyptians, is that, I don't know. But this is the great part though, right? Is that something like the Magnificat is valuable as far as that. I'm almost 100% certain that Mary sang a song after she found out she was having Jesus. Okay? And that song was passed on through the tradition of the early disciples and early Christianity to the point when it becomes recorded in gospel canon. I mean, not long. So the gospels are between 50 and 90 CE. So it becomes canon. Is it exactly verbatim what she's saying? Probably not. But it's valuable because it's her song, and it's valuable because it points to what early Christianity understood about all those things, particularly her perspective. Is it a fair encapsulation of how Mary felt about Jesus? Absolutely. Like, he lifts up those who have been brought low, brings down those who are, it's beautiful. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, exactly. Oh boy. So that, Susan, is how the Bible came to be.
There's also a section in this,
In the study Bible?
at the beginning that talks about,
Yeah.
not in as detailed as you did, but it's in
If you're, go ahead, Kurt.
No, continue, answer her because I'm going to say something.
I was going to throw out another book recommendation. There's a great book out there by Mark Zvi, M-A-R-C, Z-V-I, is his middle name, Butler, B-U-T-L-E-R. It was originally entitled How to Read the Bible. It is now entitled How to Read the Hebrew Bible, in the second edition. It is a fantastic book on kind of summarizing the construction of the canon. I cannot recommend that book highly enough. I don't think it's all that dense, but my perception might be a little bit skewed. It's not even that long. It's like maybe 200 pages, something like that. How to Read the Hebrew Bible. Cannot recommend that enough. He talks about language, the formation of the Hebrew language, and how language dictates and influences, the things that they wrote about, their concepts around God. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay, Kurt.
Okay, so we were getting back to why Jude was included. My understanding of Jude's inclusion bears on the fact that it quotes from Enoch.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
First or second, which is technically two Enochs.
Yes.
So that was in and out of our canon, and finally they decided it's out except for the Ethiopian church. And
Yes.
so it's canon. But then, in addition to that, I found out the other week, Paul's understanding of where he goes third heaven, the entire concept,
Yeah.
comes from Enoch,
Yes.
which gives Enoch authority, which gives Jude authority, which by that circular reasoning reasoning, this is why we have Jude.
This is a widely,
Why
this-
Jude's-
so next week, Brendan, I'll give kind of the blow by blow of what
Yeah.
Kurt just talked about. This is what makes Jude fascinating as a book. The content of Jude, like I said, is very contextual, because Jude's addressing a specific thing, or whoever wrote Jude. But the long chain of Jude's reasoning is absolutely fascinating, because as Kurt was referencing, Jude quotes Enoch, which is not included in the Septuagint as a post-testamental document. Enoch is from 3rd century CE. Enoch is all about the war between evil and good and light and dark and angels and demons and the whole 9 yards. And Jude is going. So what's fascinating about this is, and again, Jude's written later into the 1st century, is that we know that Enoch was being read by Christians, or at least by Jews becoming Christians during that time period, and what's considered to be valuable and authoritative. But Enoch does not make it into the canon in the 4th century, and so it ends up being a disputed book throughout this entire time period. And one of the things he references that it's not valuable in the church in Greece and Asia Minor, but it is valuable to the church in Ethiopia and broader African church. And so, again, all this points to, for me, which is one of the fascinating things, is like, the Bible is earthy. It's grounded. It's human beings literally having a conversation around, well, what do we find meaningful, right? What do we find valuable? Which is we do with everything, right? How many of you have hobbies, right? And how have you learned your hobbies? And do you not look first slow in a system? Experimentation. Lots and lots of experimentation, and so that's a bad metaphor. Anyhow, the way in which the Bible came about is the way in which a lot of human things come about, which is people use stuff that's valuable and they leave stuff that's not valuable. What's fascinating from a perspective of living in the 21st century, is now we have people going back and taking these things that were left on the side and saying, well, but what about this? And the fun part about that is that we actually have copies of, like, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, or these other Gnostic or apocryphal documents. But what we don't have access to is the decision-making process that happened when they were left out. So why aren't they included in the canon? Well, we can kind of come up with some reasons, but by and large, we don't know because we weren't there. Does that make sense? Let's talk about minor prophets. This is great. This is kind of what I was hoping we would do. Is just, talk about stuff. Okay. Minor prophets is the Bible term for it. And again, O-R and minor as in lesser, not minor as in pickaxe, or minor as in not of adult age. Okay, minor is the term that we use to describe them, generally because they're shorter. Some might argue that it's also a commentary on their authority, which is a uniquely kind of Christian issue, insofar as that, like, we love Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, because they are much broader in context. The minor prophets suffer from the same thing that, like, the book of Jude does, which is that they're addressing a very specific time and very specific issue. Okay. Here's another really helpful thing, is that I kind of agree with Judaism in this regard, which is that when we organize the Old Testament, the thing I teach my confirmation kids is the five genres of literature in the Old Testament. So Torah, Pentateuch, writings or history, major prophets, minor prophets, and wisdom literature are the five categories of stuff. So Pentateuch is first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The writings or history is everything from Joshua up through 2nd Chronicles, including some other stuff in there too. Major prophets is Daniel, it's the 5. I'm gonna forget one. The minor prophets is the other, everybody else, the 12. And then wisdom is Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, there's 5 of them. Job, Ecclesiastes, thank you. Okay. The challenge with those categorizations is that they're heaped on, not derived from. So, the reason we group the minor prophets is because they're short. The reason we group the major prophets is because they're long. The reason we call the histories is because they're histories. The reason we call wisdom is because we didn't know where else to put them. Okay. And it's more than that. There is such a thing as wisdom literature, which is a genre that arises out of the Hebrew Bible. The way the Hebrew Bible encapsulates everything is Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, okay? Which is, again, same as us, Pentateuch, prophets, everything else. So for the Hebrew, now that looks like an I, and that's confusing. The categorization that, if you get a modern Hebrew Bible, it's called Tanakh. The categorizations that they use are, well, this is the first circle. The Torah is the first circle of authority and foundation. Then the prophets are the second circle because the prophetic witness arises out of the law of Moses. Because what the prophet is so often doing is saying, hey Judah, hey Israel, here's where you're not doing this. And then the Ketuvim is kind of the third circle, which includes literally everything else. It is history, it is wisdom, it is all the things. But it's like, now here are the things that are derived from things. So here's the story about the setting that Jeremiah arose out of, right, in those years. What I like about this categorization is they don't make a distinction between major and minor. It's literally just the Nevi'im is just the prophets. And the fun thing is that it's kind of like, well, whatever's valuable is valuable, okay? Anyways, I'm getting off on a rant. That's not necessarily helpful. So, when we talk about minor prophets, there are 2 reasons why we don't really get into them too much. One reason is that they are short. I think the average chapter length of the minor prophets is like 3 or 4 chapters, right? They're short, which means that there just isn't a lot in there. Contrast that with Isaiah, which is like literally 10 times the length. There's more stuff to derive from, and we get more context, more literature from that author, so it's easier to kind of get a sense of Isaiah, what Isaiah is talking about in general. Whereas when you read something like Joel is short and to the point. That's one of the reasons. Those are small. The other reason, and I've already mentioned it, and I'm going to keep mentioning it, is because of how hyper-contextual they are. Okay? So Joel is writing about specific things happening during a specific time. Okay? Amos is probably the best kind of example of minor prophetic literature in general, because Amos, who is from Judah, being sent to Israel, who is a reluctant prophet, like how so many of them are. Amos is like, I'm only doing this once. Like, okay, you called me to do this, I'm going to get it done, and then I'm going back. I can see a shepherd, I can't remember Or dresser of sycamores, who's that? Is that Amos? That's Amos, right? Dresser of sycamores. Something like that. Okay? So let's talk about some context and concrete examples. Okay, so the book of Joel refers to the first line of Joel, which if you want to turn to Joel, please do so. Which somebody shout the page number from your study Bible.
1468.
1468. Anything notable happened in 1468? 1472, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Is that right? 92. So close. I should remember because it's also right around here that Martin Luther was born, is when Columbus leaves for the New World at the behest of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yeah, 1492.
I had a phone in my dorm many years ago, and my roommate wanted to know what the phone number was. I said, well, it's 881 1942, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You never got any phone call.
Oh, 1942. Well, there was a lot happening in 1942. All right, everybody find Joel? Okay. Oh, I should probably open it too. I thought I told you. So Joel, like so many of the minor prophets, is short. 3 chapters long. And Joel follows, even in those short 3 chapters, kind of the general prophetic outline, which exists, okay? It's a thing, which is mind-blowing, well, not mind-blowing, it's really important to think about, which is that the prophetic tradition that comes out of, this period of the history of Israel, it's not just people shouting at clouds, right? It's not just people, that there literally is almost like a genre tradition that exists in prophesying, which is that when you write down the prophetic, words of Joel, it's following an outline that is fairly established by the genre, okay? Which is, and this is a rough outline. Somebody else might. Part 1. You identify the problem. Oftentimes, this will begin with critiquing neighboring countries or neighboring peoples. Okay, this is in Isaiah. This is in Amos. This is in Joel. Which is, here's what the other people are doing that God's ticked off about. Okay, part 2. Attacking internal issues. Here's what Judah or Israel is doing that God's ticked off about. Part 3. Here's what God's going to do about it. The prophet announcing the judgment of God because of part 2. And then part 4 is optional. And part 4 is, but wait, there's good news. So it's almost like, I just got done, giving 3 chapters of doom and gloom, but there's hope, right? And this kind of outline, it's almost in every prophetic tradition. Now, when you get into something like Isaiah or Jeremiah, these bigger books, you'll see this cycle happen several times throughout the book, okay, throughout the tradition. But this is a pretty good general outline of how it. Now, again, the fascinating question here, and I apologize, I'm getting way off the reservation. The fascinating question here is that, did they teach this? Right? When you went to Hebrew school, did they teach this is how, or is this just kind of similarly to the canon, that just this, people figured out this is how it's done? This stuff still happens all the time. When people are writing song lyrics or doing poetry, if you ask a 5-year-old to write a poem, what do? They do a quatrain that rhymes on alternating verses, right? or a limerick, or a haiku, right? Did somebody sit down and say, this is how you write a haiku, right? This is like, I'm creating the genre of haiku, it's 575, or did that arise out of hundreds of years of poetry that kind of coagulated into the tradition? I think it's more the latter. How does the prophetic model arise? Is there somebody that's teaching you that this is how you do it, or is it just kind of like, this is how it's done? Does that make sense? Okay. So, Joel, 3 chapters. Joel is hard to do. So, Joel self-decays. In other words, Joel references the reign of King Joash, who is, well, I'm not going to get into, well, I don't want to get into Joash per se, but also references, or appears to references some of the reformations of King Josiah. So, when we talk about Joel being written in the 900s, it's because Joel is speaking specifically about events that happen in this time period. But if you ask scholars when Joel was written, I'm just going to read to you bullet points of all the different proposed datings of Joel. So I already mentioned 9th century, specifically because of it mentions stuff that happens during the reign of Joash. The specific enemies that Israel had during that time, which Joel mentioned, the Philistines, Phoenicians, Egypt, and Eden, that's consistent with this dating. Also, they don't mention the Assyrians or the Babylonians, who don't become the main bad guys until the 8th century. Okay? Well, Assyrians, particularly Babylonians, later, 6th and 7th century. So that tracks. One of the other proposed dates, that was proposed date number 1. Proposed date number 2 is 8th century, so 700 BCE, during the reign of Uzziah. And the reason that this one is being suggested is because Joel uses similar language to that found in Hosea, Amos, and Jonah. And Hosea, Amos, and Jonah are all originating out of that period under Uzziah. So the theory there is that somebody around the 7th or the 8th century is writing about this time period. And the reason they argue that is because of the language that's used. Okay, that's date number 2 out of 6. Date number 3 is somewhere between 630 and 587 BC, which is the last, it's before the end of the kingdom. 587 is when the kingdom of Judah gets taken into exile. Okay, which is contemporary with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Habakkuk. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Habakkuk are written around that time, which is similarly, they're drawing comparisons between the language in Joel and that in those major prophetic traditions. Then there's 520 to 500 BCE, and this is finally where we get to, I erased it, our 500 to 400 time period, which is basically, it's the return of the exiles, and this is when we get Zechariah and Haggai. And then finally, the last proposed date is during the Persian period, so around 400 BCE, or even around 350, because there's a line in Joel that might or might not reference the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 587 after the conquest by Babylon, and as a past event. And so they're saying, well, and then there's finally some scholars, very minor, that are like, well, Joel might have been written during the Ptolemaic period, which is much later. That would be contemporary with Daniel in 301 to 201, because it uses earlier texts and seems to have a similar worldview to that of the Hebrew people, or the Jewish people during that century. Okay? I'm not expecting you to remember any of this. I just want you to understand how people are looking at and trying to piece apart Joel. Okay? And all the different ways in which we're approaching the text, trying to get an understanding of it. So we're looking at language similarities and dating it to a time period based off of as if grammar used or even specific vocabulary. We're also looking at literally the historical witness. Like, well, Joel talks about the reign of King Joash, so it comes to that. We're also looking at the general philosophical or type of argument that Joel is making and saying, well, that's actually more reminiscent of kind of the way of thinking that dates around 400, 300 BCE. Okay? So the question is, when was Joel written? 900, 700, 600, 500, 400? And the answer is yes. And the answer is yes. And here, and this is, again, the extremely valuable thing about this is that Peter, the Apostle Peter, quotes Joel. Anybody off the top of your head know where Peter quotes Joel? Pentecost! Your young men shall dream dreams. This is straight from Joel. And so what's cool about this is that we can do all the scholarly work of trying to figure out when Joel was written, who wrote it, what time period it dates from, what are the philosophies and the grammar being used, all of which are valuable and important. And the cool thing is that Peter had read Joel and found it valuable in analyzing the situation that he was experiencing in that moment. Okay? And this is kind of scripture in general. Now, do you think that Peter knew any of that? Probably not. Do you think that Peter was aware of it? This is attending church at wherever to research the historicity and the authorship of Joel before reading Joel. However, I think it is vitally important that we at least are aware of or comprehend the complex and organic nature of the texts that we hold to be authoritative. Okay? And this is, for me, what is valuable about studying the minor prophets. And we didn't even actually read any of Joel. I apologize for that. To be fair, I spent a good 40 minutes answering Susan's question. The Bible. So that's my fault, my bad. Israel is creating, they're saying, here's the deal. We're going to experience the consequences of this. Similar to what Amos is saying. Amos is one of my favorite of the minor prophets. Amos, you lie on beds of ivory. There's verses in there of Amos pointing out the wealth gap present in Israel during the time of his prophecy. They're looking at their world and saying, here's what's going on. What I find remarkably valuable about it as well too is that in trying to articulate their words, they're pulling from a broad tradition that exists within their culture, right? So I think about there's a musician who's really popular right now who I'm okay and he's okay. Jesse Wells, has anybody heard that? Just had. He's okay. I'm being a snob. Jesse Wells is basically plagiarizing Bob Dylan. Not literally, but he's taking the stuff that Dylan did in the 60s and 70s, and he's contemporizing it for the 21st century. And what's powerful about it, even though I don't really like him that much, is that he is looking at the protest songs that Dylan was singing during an intense period of history. Civil rights movement, Vietnam War, a lot of Dylan's music. Any Dylan fans in here? I know, Jim, yeah. Okay. One of the things, late Dylan, not so much. A lot of the tracks, Dylan, that's kind of my jam. In that time period. What's powerful about Dylan is he's looking at his world and he is prophesying. He's saying, here's what's going on, here are the consequences we're going to experience from it. But he's doing it in music, right? And he's doing it by stealing, and I'm using stealing a little bit aggressively here, but by stealing earlier traditions, like the blues of Mississippi John Hurt and these black artists from the early 20th century, late 19th century, who are doing very rudimentary, raw, finger-style guitar, and Dylan's taking that and he's using that tradition, that genre, that way of singing and playing, interpreting it in his world, but he's looking at the problems that are going on in his world. Jesse Wells is doing the same thing. What Jesse Wells is famous for is all of his videos are him standing in some random rural location in West Virginia, and with the background of the woods behind him, and it's just him and a guitar. He was on Stephen Colbert. I mean, the dude's made it, which is weird, but he's doing Bob Dylan. So what's cool to think about for me is, and we'll talk about this next week, finally, we'll talk about like after content, is that what we see in the minor prophets is Amos steals from Micah, who steals from Joel, who steals from, is that there is an interconnectivity throughout these folks where they're using the experiences and the ways of prophesying, the ways of speaking that have been used by their contemporaries or their forebears, and they're taking that as a way of communicating their voice and the issues that they see going on all around them. And this is the thing. I don't expect everybody to know this, but I hope people have curiosity towards it because it's pretty darn cool, right? It's pretty darn cool because it doesn't just give us insight into God and into humanity's relationship with God. It gives us insight into how we interpret that relationship as well, too, and how we interpret the interaction between God and the world and events and all that stuff. So as we're looking around at our world, we're saying, I don't like that, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. We are the most recent in a long line of human beings who've been doing the exact same thing. Right? Who've been listening for the voice of God speaking to us and saying, man, I wish things were different. And here's what I think God's going to do. Okay? Alright, sorry. I'm surprised my watch wasn't yelling at me. I need to relax. Okay, so next week is going to be a bridge week. So the ones that I had prepped for were Joel, Zephaniah, Amos, and Obadiah. Obadiah, just because I like the name Obadiah. So if we want to talk about any of those, we can next week. We can also launch into looking forward into New Testament stuff. So we can talk about Jude. We can talk about anything we want to, but I'm specifically wanting to look at like minor letters, so like the letters of John, the letters of Peter, that are less minor, but we don't deal with them so much. Any of that stuff, okay? So if you've got something that you want to bring in next week, please bring it. We'll talk about that, or I'll just give you another 40-minute rant on that. All right, folks. Let's see you in worship.